On July 26, 1947, in Washington, D.C., Harry Truman signs the National Security Act. On September 18th, its key provisions take effect, and the United States' new Central Intelligence Agency formally comes into being. The country has just fought its way through a world war and is walking straight into another showdown with the Soviet Union. Someone has to sort through all the rumors, the intercepted messages, the field reports, and tell the president what an enemy can actually do before it happens. That is where Colonel Oscar W. Koch comes in. He is not a famous spy chief. In the last war, his job was to grab every scrap of information he could find and warn George Patton before the Germans could sneak up on him. Under him, Third Army's intelligence section worked like a grinder. Radio intercepts, aerial photos, prisoner talks, even boring fuel and ammunition reports all went into the same pile. The point was to see where the German units were and what they were getting ready to do. After the war, the army makes Koch a teacher, first at its intelligence school, then in occupied Austria. From there, he helps build the new CIA in its early years by training the officers who will work inside it. Before any of that, Koch did not come from the world that usually shows up in stories about the CIA's origins. He was born in 1897 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, went to public schools, and joined the Wisconsin National Guard Cavalry before the First World War. He served on the Mexican border and then in France as an artilleryman, and he ended that war not as a heroic field commander, but as an instructor, turning fresh battlefield lessons into usable material for new officers. In the years between the wars, the army pushed him further in that direction. At the cavalry school at Fort Riley, he taught tactics and communications and studied how people learn. The army sent him to university to study education, published his work on how to train officers. He translated German manuals into English for American officers. Before we continue, hit the like button and let me know in the comments where you're listening from. By the late 1930s, colleagues said Koch was methodical and very clear in his explanations, the kind of instructor who could break complex ideas into plain language. He was the opposite of the popular image of secret work with trench coats and gadgets. He was a teacher in uniform. By the late 1930s, colleagues said he was methodical and very clear in his explanations, the kind of instructor who could break complex ideas into plain language. He was the opposite of the popular image of secret work with trench coats and gadgets. He was a teacher in uniform. That was the man George Patton knew before the Second World War, a fellow cavalryman and instructor who understood both horses and radio nets. When war came again, that mix of classroom skill and field experience was exactly what Patton needed. In North Africa, Sicily, and then across France, Patton's formations moved fast and his headquarters had to keep up. Koch's G2 section could not just pile up reports and hope a pattern appeared. He built what later historians would call an all-source system. Third Army intelligence teams pulled from intercepted radio traffic, aerial photographs, prisoner interrogations, captured documents, and reports from units at the front, and forced those pieces into a single, constantly updated picture of the enemy. No single stream was treated as magic. Ultra, the Allied code-breaking program, was valuable but not infallible. Prisoner reports were rich but uneven. Aerial photos could mislead. Koch's habit was to ask of every new fragment which other source supports this or cuts against it. Inside Third Army headquarters, that approach produced a different kind of daily brief. Instead of dramatic stories and neat predictions, his reports laid out what the Germans could still do, pointed to gaps, and avoided exaggeration. Patton later called him the best intelligence officer in any United States command, not because he told him what he wanted to hear, but because he calmly explained what the enemy still had the strength to attempt. That way of working, fusing every available source and refusing to lean on a single comfortable narrative, became the thread that ran through Koch's career, from the deserts of Tunisia to the classrooms at Fort Riley and later into the early training schools of the CIA. The sharpest test of that method came in the autumn of 1944. By then, Paris had been liberated, and many Allied headquarters believed Germany was close to collapse. Intelligence summaries talked about exhausted divisions and fuel shortages. On paper, the Germans looked finished. Koch's section kept finding details that did not fit that story. German armored divisions were slipping out of the line and regrouping. Aerial reconnaissance picked up heavy rail traffic toward the Ardennes. Prisoners talked about rebuilt formations. Reports from other commands noted strong units moving into reserve. Piece by piece, the picture pointed toward a large counterattack through a thinly held sector where bad winter weather could ground Allied aircraft. On December 9, 1944, Patton called for a special briefing. In that room, Koch argued that the Germans were preparing a major offensive in the Ardennes and that Third Army had to be ready to turn north. Patton listened and told his planners to prepare the move, even though many senior officers elsewhere were convinced that Germany could not risk such a blow. A week later, German forces struck with what became known as the Battle of the Bulge. Higher-level Allied intelligence had been caught off guard, but Third Army was able to pivot toward the crisis and move to relieve Bastogne faster than many expected. When Koch looked back on that winter, he did not claim that he had special sources. The reports existed in various headquarters. In his view, the real failure lay in how those reports were weighed. Many analysts simply did not believe an exhausted enemy would attempt such an attack and ignored the pattern in front of them. For Koch, the lesson was clear. Intelligence was not just a pile of secrets. It was the disciplined evaluation of what you already had, under pressure, even when it clashed with what leaders hoped was true. That idea shaped the work he went on to do next, in the schools and in the new agency that was starting to take shape in Washington. After the war in Europe ended, the United States faced a problem that was less visible than demobilization, but just as practical: what to do with the hard-earned craft of wartime intelligence. Thousands of officers had spent the war reading prisoner reports, studying aerial photos, and tracking enemy movements. If they simply went home and those habits scattered, the next crisis would have to start from scratch. The Army's answer was to build a permanent intelligence school. On July 1st, 1946, at Fort Riley in Kansas, the Army Ground Forces Intelligence School opened in the old cavalry school buildings. The horses were gone. In their place came officers who had fought in Europe and the Pacific and now faced a shrinking peacetime force and an uncertain political landscape. Oscar Koch, still in uniform, was assigned as deputy commandant and instructor. In 1947, he became the commandant, responsible for shaping what the Army called its new generation of ground intelligence officers. Those classrooms looked dull at first glance. Chalkboards with contour lines and symbols, officers bent over aerial photographs, mimeographed radio intercepts on the desks. The important change was in how problems were framed. Koch did not spend his time drilling tables of organization or long lists of foreign units. Colleagues said he pushed officers to see that no single report, however dramatic, could be trusted. On its own, he took the habits refined in North Africa and France and turned them into structured exercises. One drill, according to later accounts, might begin with a seemingly minor prisoner report, a captured corporal mentioning an unfamiliar unit designation. Students had to match that scrap against air photos of rail yards, changes in radio traffic, and supply estimates. Only conclusions that were backed by more than one source would stand. He used recent campaigns as case studies in failure as well as success. German withdrawals in North Africa that looked like collapse had sometimes concealed new lines and counterattacks. In Sicily, assumptions about where landings were likely had been upset by terrain and weather. In the Ardennes, Allied confidence about German fuel shortages had led some staffs to discount reports that pointed toward a major offensive. Koch's central message, as former students later put it, was simple. An intelligence officer's job was not to confirm what a commander already believed, but to describe what the enemy could realistically attempt, even when that was inconvenient or seemed improbable. Later, United States Army intelligence histories credited Third Army's wartime system, and by extension, Koch's teaching, with giving the service one of its earliest sustained examples of fully integrated all-source collection and analysis. Prisoner interrogation, in particular, was rated as one of the most valuable sources of combat information when it was used systematically alongside signals and imagery. At Fort Riley, those ideas started to harden into doctrine. Officers passed through the school and carried this way of working with them into staff jobs, occupation duty, and eventually into new institutions. While Koch was drilling students on the Kansas prairie, another and more famous argument over the future of American intelligence was playing out in Washington. In popular memory, the CIA's origin story often runs through a small circle of names and institutions. William Wild Bill Donovan, the charismatic head of the Wartime Office of Strategic Services, pressed for a permanent peacetime intelligence agency. Alan Dulles and other OSS veterans argued that the United States needed a central clearinghouse for information in the new atomic age. Lawyers and policy advisors, many from Ivy League and Wall Street backgrounds, drafted memoranda on how to build such a service. The reality of 1945 and 1946 was more complicated. President Harry Truman dissolved the OSS in October 1945. Its research and analysis branch moved into the State Department, and its covert operations became a temporary unit inside the War Department. In January 1946, Truman created the Central Intelligence Group, a coordinating body meant to bridge the gap between wartime improvisation and a permanent peacetime agency. The National Security Act of 1947 later established the Central Intelligence Agency and the National Security Council in law. On paper, these changes took place in Washington offices. In practice, they depended on two very different streams of people and habits. One stream came from the OSS and from the Eastern establishment that staffed much of its leadership and many early CIA posts, men whose formative experiences involved diplomacy, law, and clandestine operations in European capitals. The other stream came from places like Fort Riley and from wartime headquarters in Europe, officers whose experience centered on the patient fusion of reports for commanders rather than on running agents in neutral cities. Koch clearly belonged to this second current. While some planners in Washington argued over how much authority a new central agency should have, he was teaching majors and captains that the hardest part of intelligence work was not collecting more secrets, but asking the right questions of the information already in hand. Over time, these two cultures, clandestine operations and structured analysis, would have to live under the same roof. The first major test of that coexistence came in occupied Europe, and for Koch, it meant leaving Kansas in 1948 for a very different setting. Austria, like Germany, had been divided into zones of occupation. The United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union each administered their own sector, and Vienna itself was carved into 4 parts with a central district run jointly by all 4 powers, a smaller and earlier version of what Berlin would become in the public imagination. General Jeffrey Keyes served as the United States High Commissioner and Commander of American forces in Austria, and Koch became his Director of Intelligence. The target now looked very different from the German field armies he had tracked on maps during the war. Instead of focusing mainly on numbered divisions and corps headquarters, his staff had to follow Soviet occupation forces, security services, emerging Austrian political parties, and a dense mix of refugees, former Nazis, resistance veterans, and new activists. Economic control in the Soviet zone, including nationalized or expropriated industries, carried political weight. Election results in Vienna, labor disputes, and trade patterns all gave clues about where the country might lean. Koch brought the same all-source approach he had used under Patton. Reports from patrols on borders and key roads were matched against diplomatic cables, Austrian police summaries, and intercepted communications. Refugees arriving from the east brought information about Soviet units and security practices. Economic data on production and trade in different zones helped his staff judge the reach of Soviet-backed organizations. Election returns and public opinion reports showed how much support communist parties actually held. Vienna, in the late 1940s, became one of the early Cold War testing grounds. Western and Soviet services both tried to recruit, influence, and penetrate each other's networks, and, for American commanders, understanding that landscape required more than counting tanks. It needed the kind of careful source grading and cross-checking that Koch had been teaching in Kansas. During this period, United States authorities decided that routine intelligence collection in Austria should gradually shift from the army to the new civilian agency in Washington. Accounts of the time say Koch took part in that handoff, helping transfer sources, methods, and reporting channels from his military staff to representatives of the Central Intelligence Agency. It was not just a ceremony. Local agents, contact networks, and analytic files had to be passed on in ways that preserved their usefulness and protected people on the ground. The process illustrated a broader division of labor that was taking shape. The army would continue to concentrate on order of battle assessments and support to commanders, while the new CIA increasingly took the lead on political analysis, covert action, and long-range estimates for national leaders. The line between those roles was never perfectly clean, but Austria showed how they could be separated in practice. It also marked the point where Koch's career, rooted in cavalry patrols and artillery classrooms, intersected directly with the emerging world of American civilian intelligence. By the early 1950s, the CIA was still young and unsettled. It had absorbed the Central Intelligence Group and what remained of the OSS. It was building directorates for clandestine operations, analysis, and support, and recruiting people from the armed services, universities, and business. What it lacked in many areas was consistent training. The agency needed more than basic tradecraft courses. It needed a way to teach new officers how to think about information in a world where rumors, ideological stories, and politically convenient narratives could move faster than verifiable facts. In that setting, the name Oscar W. Koch appeared again. After his time in Austria, he was brought into the CIA as Deputy Director of Training Special, responsible for preparing covert personnel. He held that post until early 1952, when he was succeeded by Rolf W. Kingsley, a change later noted in internal training records and institutional histories. If Fort Riley's classrooms had been filled mainly with Army officers, the rooms Koch now helped oversee were more mixed. There were former OSS veterans used to the looser wartime culture of operations. There were linguists and academics drawn by the new Cold War mission. There were officers rotating in from the services and young civilians who had never worn a uniform. The questions, however, were familiar. How do you weigh a single passionate source against a large body of quieter, more prosaic reports? How do you avoid being drawn to dramatic stories that match what policymakers hope is true? How do you spot preparations for a crisis before it shows up in public? Koch did not try to turn the CIA into a military staff, but colleagues said he brought in habits forged in war. He emphasized discipline in reporting, precise times, locations, and attributions. Every report was expected to include a clear description of how the information had been obtained and a frank assessment of the source's access and reliability. Analysts were pushed to label their judgments so that it was clear what was solid, what was inferred, and what was speculation. He stressed cross-checking. A single defector's account about a Soviet unit, for example, should be compared with aerial photography, communications intercepts, and economic data. If the stories lined up too neatly with existing assumptions, he warned that this was a danger sign rather than a comfort. He also pressed for operational officers and analysts to work together instead of treating collection and assessment as separate worlds. The people running agents needed to understand how their reports were judged, and the people writing estimates needed to know what pressures and limits shaped collection. The Battle of the Bulge was one of the cases he used most often. Koch argued that the Ardennes surprise was not mainly a collection failure. The elements of the German buildup, withdrawn divisions, rail traffic, supply dumps, had all been visible. The failure, as he described it, came when commanders and staffs who were convinced that Germany was too weak to launch such an attack ignored the pattern those pieces formed. In training, that episode became a way to force new officers to confront their own biases. Students were given partial sets of wartime reports and asked to draw conclusions, and then they were shown what actually happened and where their reasoning had gone wrong. Inside the agency, training did not have much glamour. It rarely produced headlines or memoirs. But CIA histories of the period note that the early 1950s were when internal schools and routines for vetting, briefing, and debriefing took more systematic shape. And Koch's tenure meant that a wartime intelligence officer who had seen evaluation fail and succeed under fire stood at the center of that process. At the same time, the young CIA was also building other very different kinds of capabilities. While Koch was teaching source grading and analytic discipline, United States Army G2, and later the Central Intelligence Agency, were also sponsoring a network very different from Third Army's methodical intelligence staff, the Gehlen Organization. Reinhard Gehlen, former head of the Wehrmacht's Foreign Armies East Section, surrendered to United States forces in 1945 after arranging for microfilmed archives on the Soviet Union to be made available. American intelligence accepted his proposal to run an anti-Soviet espionage service using many of his former subordinates. By 1946, under United States Army G2 oversight, and after 1949, under Central Intelligence Agency sponsorship, the Gehlen organization became a significant source of reporting on the Soviet bloc. It employed large numbers of former Wehrmacht officers and former Nazi Party members, and later formed the core of West Germany's Federal Intelligence Service. 4. Officials in Washington. The arrangement promised eyes and ears behind the Iron Curtain at a time when Western services had limited access there. Later reviews were sharply divided on its effectiveness and on the ethics of the arrangement, and some CIA and academic assessments argued that relying on networks with such backgrounds carried serious risks, including disinformation and political distortion. Koch's work did not directly intersect with the Gehlen organization, and there is no record of him publicly attacking or defending it, but the contrast between the two strands of early Cold War intelligence is clear. On one side was a network built around personalities and access, backed in the hope that former enemies could now serve as guides to the Soviet system. On the other was a quieter effort in training branches and staff schools to instill habits that did not depend on any single star agent, rigorous source evaluation, structured analytic methods, and a willingness to challenge what leaders assumed. The young CIA carried both legacies forward. In 1954, nearly 4 decades after he first put on a uniform, Oscar Koch briefly returned to a more traditional line of command. He was promoted to brigadier general in the Army of the United States and assigned as assistant division commander of the 25th Infantry Division in the Korean Theater, at a time when the armistice had ended major fighting, but the peninsula remained heavily militarized. For a period, he served as acting division commander before moving in June to the Career Management Division in the office of the Army Adjutant General. He retired from active duty in September 1954, closing a formal army career that had begun with horse patrols before the First World War. On paper, that retirement ended his service, but his connection to intelligence work continued. Like a number of officers with specialized skills in the early Cold War, Koch was placed on the State Department payroll as cover, while in fact working for the Central Intelligence Agency, and the specific nature of that CIA work remains unknown because he did not discuss it with friends, relatives, or his biographer. What can be seen is not a list of operations, but the trail he left in doctrine and in the training culture of the organizations he touched. In the 1950s, he received a Guggenheim Fellowship to write about military intelligence, an unusual distinction for a serving or recently retired general. Near the end of his life, he completed a book with Robert G. Hayes, G2, Intelligence for Patton, a study of how Third Army's intelligence section functioned in practice. Published in 1971 after his death, it has been used as a reference by military intelligence professionals studying all source operations in the European theater. In 1970, Oscar W. Koch died at a Veterans Administration hospital in Marion, Illinois. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery under a standard white headstone marked with his rank and branch. The stone does not indicate that the man beneath it once briefed Patton on a coming offensive or later helped shape the training of CIA officers. More than 2 decades later, the Army formally recognized what many professionals in the field already believed. In 1993, Koch was inducted into the United States Army Military Intelligence Hall of Fame. The official citation stated that he had done more for the development of combat intelligence than any other American intelligence officer prior to or during the Second World War, and in the same year the Army Intelligence Center named a building after him. His influence, though, lies less in plaques and building names than in the way institutions think. Looking back, it is tempting to describe Oscar Koch as a hidden architect, the single mastermind who built the CIA. But that would not match the record. He did not design the agency's charter. That work fell to presidents, cabinet officers, and legislators reacting to the experience of global war and the early tensions of the Cold War. He did not run CIA stations or sign national estimates under his own name. His story is more modest, and in some ways more revealing. Few officers of his generation followed a path like his. From horse cavalry on the Mexican border to artillery instructor in France, from educational psychology and teaching at Fort Riley to G2 of Patton's Third Army, from a prairie intelligence school to occupied Vienna, and from a deputy directorship in CIA training to a final general's post with the 25th Infantry Division. At each step, colleagues and students said he carried the same basic idea forward, that intelligence is not primarily about collecting Secrets, but about how people pose questions and assemble fragments into a picture they are willing to act on. In the Battle of the Bulge, that way of thinking helped one American army see a German offensive forming where others saw a beaten enemy. In Kansas, it helped turn wartime improvisations into doctrine for new officers. In Austria, it shaped the transfer of routine collection from military staffs to a civilian agency. Inside the CIA training branch, it gave new officers a framework for judging source reports against other streams of evidence, long before phrases such as all-source fusion became common. The institutions that emerged from that era, the Army's intelligence organizations, the CIA, the wider American intelligence community, were built by many hands. Their histories contain both notable successes and serious failures, moments of clear warning and times when judgments were badly wrong. Yet in their manuals, schools, and internal critiques, traces of Koch's influence are visible. They show up when an instructor tells new analysts that the job is not to reassure a commander, but to lay out what an adversary can realistically do. They are present when training exercises force students to work through past failures rather than focus only on lucky successes. They appear in post-mortem studies that distinguish between gaps in collection and failures of evaluation, in debates over whether a surprise came from not knowing or from not believing information that was already available. In later decades, when people inside and outside government argued over controversies from surprise attacks to misjudged weapons programs, the pattern Koch highlighted after the Ardennes often reappeared. The raw material was frequently on file. The difficulty lay in overcoming the human tendency to discount information that did not fit the expected picture. Oscar W. Koch's name seldom appears in those later arguments, but the habits associated with him count the divisions that are missing as well as the ones on the line, match dramatic reports against quieter data, treat your own assumptions as things to be examined rather than anchors, remain part of the way American intelligence tries to think under pressure. In December 1944, he stood over a map and outlined an attack that, according to later recollections, seemed to many in Europe almost unthinkable. On a July morning in 1946, he walked into a classroom at Fort Riley and began turning that way of thinking into a curriculum. A few years after that, he took it into a different set of corridors under a new seal and a new acronym. The tanks, the fronts, and the adversaries have changed. The pressure to believe that an enemy will behave as we expect has not. Koch's longest-running struggle was never just against a single army or ideology. It was against that pressure, and in the practices of the schools and agencies he helped shape, that struggle has continued beyond his lifetime. Thanks for watching, and please consider subscribing and click the video on the screen to watch another.